show you a few images of my artwork so that you have an idea, a feeling from where I am talking about, where I take my ideas from. But then I will not show them while I'm speaking because it might be too complicated. So I show you a bit of the exhibition right now. Well, that's the name of it. If you get it, oops. No, I've done the wrong thing. Now it will take us hours. Just 1 second. I'm going to fix it. Okay. Maybe like this. So when you enter the exhibition, to the right, we see a table with drawings, works on paper from 85, basically from 85 to 89. At this level, you see notebooks and scenographies from notebooks, which means that you don't exactly see what is in the notebooks, but pages that I scanned and then worked upon and changed what I wanted to change. So we have an idea of what's in the notebooks, but we don't have the real one. Now if we go around the table, this is what you see. The scenographs of the notebooks are hanged from the wall so that people are invited to touch it and turn it and have a look, do what they want. And the grains of the theory and also other things, they are all in these pages. Another view of the exhibition in the right side there, and then you see the paintings. And I will say one word about the paintings. Again, these are from 92 until today. And the way they are hanged has to do with the feeling of the curator, Catherine, for the way that my work is hanged in the studio. So even though each curator can choose its own structure and how to move between paintings, sometimes they belong to very different period, like 10 years difference, they still are connected. But wait a minute, let's tell this never register. So we had enough of you. Okay. So I want to show you a few of the works, a sort of a closer look at them. But the idea indeed is quite hospitable to allow the viewer have a feeling of the studio. This doesn't mean that we don't want to look at each work separately or that we cannot do that, because we can. Now I want to show you to have a certain look on individual works. Drawings. Notebooks. This is a glossary I promised my class. It's the beginning of a glossary, but you will have a better glossary very soon, I promise. And this is from a series of painting called Eurydice. Eurydice number 23 from the 90s. This is a recent series, Ophelia, Eurydice and Ophelia, number 1 and number 2. Small oil painting that I'm doing for 7 years, more or less, and they are finished now. Ophelia and Eurydice number 3. And the most recent work, which I called No Title Yet. You have No Title Yet, and Saint John the Baptist. And Oil on Canvas, 2003-2009, and No Title Yet and Saint Anne, a work I finished recently. They are all in the exhibition. And I'm tempted to leave it here, but I think that I shouldn't. So we can close this now, the visual. I can take off the image, put on the light. I hope to address today two major subjects that came up in my work in the recent years, and to link this subject and to show you how they are all linked. The space of therapy, the space of transference, and the space of working art, the space of looking at art. And there is one figure that maybe you still have in mind, maybe not. A certain figure that repeats itself, the figure of a woman, a mother. We see mother and baby. We know we are addressing a situation that is horrifying. There's another kind of image of a woman that I'm working on, a woman with a shaven head, which is quite a strong symbol if we are thinking about Hiroshima Mon Amour, but this was not my intention when I started to work on that. These are works from 20 years ago. And I will start on a personal note. The woman, always also mother figure, in all its apparition, has always haunted me. She has haunted me from as far as my memory starts, from before my memory starts, and therefore I have recognized her. She haunts me from and in this time-space where fascination, awe, and compassion go hand in hand, before fear, before guilt, before shame, before action, before cognition, and even before abjection and disgust. She haunts me because her traces have functioned from within me, from before I even knew that such is also my virtuality or possibility or my non-possibility. I keep knowing her as long as primary awe, compassion, and fascinance make me affectively access the other. And I keep losing her when awe, compassion, and fascinance are overcome by splitting mechanism and get diverted into different expressions of fear, intermingled with a freezing fascination that Lacan calls fascinum. This woman with the shaven head, she reminds you of someone? She is disgraced. She could be your mother or your daughter. She could be you. Is she beautiful? She might sit in the same position as the Mona Lisa, but looking closely, you feel the curves of the turning of her head downwards, her face distorted. Is it pain or is it shame? She is seemingly crazy, but is she? Or is the world, and more or less, and more so, too crazy for her? And what would that mean? And she doesn't want to look at us. I will show her again in a moment later on. Yet even when she turns her back, she refuses objectality. Some forms of turning the back are subjectal indeed. And she subjectivizes you when she resists your objectivization of her. If you fragilize yourself to the extent of letting her vulnerability touch you, she asks you to meet her where both her and you transcend her objectality. Such is, too, the call emanating from painting and drawing and from art, if it reaches primary awe and primary compassion and work from their combined space. When she looks at us, she sees without returning our gaze. She is gazing at us and at eternity. It is us who are looked at and called upon, but what for and why? The horror she sees is between the terrible and us. It is the terrible and it is us, human beings after innocence in a post-traumatic era. Post in the sense of trance that is being saturated with the dispersed traces of trauma. The wonder we feel is in her and in us too. There is this amazement combined with primary awe, an early manifestation of the sublime. There is this compassion we feel mixed with fascinance, an early manifestation of beauty. Eros is there, but she is always too early torn away from us in a move that can turn us and herself into the horrible. Yet when our gaze is still mixed with compassion and awe, a possibility of love always still hinted, and this possibility is being reopened again and again, but not in any case, and not if we view from a distance, but only as long as you remain amazed, in awe and in compassion. So I would like you to consider the idea that awe and compassion are primary affects that labor as signals and are felt, shared, and transmitted by resonance. Like the unheimlich anxiety, they correspond to phenomena and occurrences on the aesthetic, nascent level. They are perceived and inscribed in difference from their transmission, because each one of us, not as a full subject, but as a partial subject, as a transject, at a level of transjectivity, also elaborate them in parallel, in accordance with its own subjectal and objectal positioning. It is here that a move to ethicality becomes possible, not necessarily, and it is not imposed. There is only a possibility, a choice, an option. So we can see that there is a certain primary option of what we call freedom and of what we can call resistance. Compassion and awe are aesthetical, proto-ethical accesses to the other, to the cosmos. Aesthetical overtures, openings, that touch the human ethical potentiality in instances of reattunement and co-inhabituating to one another, with the other, a stranger or some strangers. And this is offered by artworking and also by certain dimension, a healing dimension within the transferential psychoanalytical approach. Since they are primary, they arise in connectivity. They arise in a state in which the I is connected to the non-I in a very primordial way. And they index the opening of an access, and yet they are not reactive. We must think of a certain possibility that something affective arises, and still it is not reactive. Being non-reactive, they are therefore royal roads to resistance and freedom. Resistance in this sense is resistance not to the other and to the outside, not necessarily to the other and to the outside, but to begin with, to the self, or rather to the tendency of the self to protect its border and to turn the other into an object and the self into a subject, and in general to the idea of identity, of closed, strong identities. Freedom is, therefore, to begin with, freedom from reactivity. And we have to ask ourselves, what are our human tools for freedom, for reactivity? What enables us this position? If awe and compassion are primary aesthetical affects, then this gives us new tools for thinking on, in, and by art. These aesthetical affects are proto-ethical. They are not yet ethical. A proto-ethical opening of ethical possibilities doesn't mean that an ethical approach will be of necessity taken. But an opening is there, and an awareness to it is offered, and the subject then might take the decision to choose a particular approach or not to choose it. An approach sustained not by laws and regulations, but by the affects arising through, via, and during self-fragilization in the encounter with the vulnerable other and the vulnerability of the world. So we are talking about, on the one hand, the vulnerable other, or the vulnerability in the other, which is of necessity connected to me, and self-fragilization, which is a move that we might choose not to do. And there is a choice here. The unheimlich anxiety, the uncanny, points at either object or its lack, what Lacan calls objet A, and implies opposition and revolt as critical tool. Renovation and revolution engages then the mechanisms of split and of denial. There is always the enemy which is worse than myself, or something of that kind. But there is another cluster of affects then, which function first on the aesthetical level and then leads to a spiralic renewal, we can call it, evolution in the sense of a rolling or revolving motion and a turn of a spiral or a coil from the Latin volutio and from the Latin volut, rolled, from the verb volvere, that suggests volution as a revolution. What I have referred to in earlier essays is the hallowing inside the human existence, not in relation to deity or to God. That is, it is bringing us into the domain of a non-sacrificial time-space, holy time-space, within the subject, within transsubjectivity, accessed by the turning of the affective aesthetical awe and compassion into an ethical awareness. Awe, compassion, and fascinance produce artistic effects that in turn arouse, again in a spiralic way, because we are talking all the time about the matrixial space, which I'm not going to repeat too much on that, but is a space of co-emergence where I and non-I co-emerge constantly at the same moment, and therefore there's always the unknown, and we don't know what we are accessing, and there must be therefore a sort of a spiralic move. In a spiralic way, new aesthetical occasions for a passage of the subject through this level to the ethical by border linking and border spacing, and through a certain kind of coexistence that I call witnessing with the other, which sustains witnessing, the capacity to witness, but not from the outside, not I look at you, but from this witnessing of I and non-I in a passage from being partial subjects or transjects into a position or level of being subjects. So what I'm saying, for those who are acquainted with the matrixial theory, that the matrixial possibilities are always a dimension that we can access, the subject can access, and then the subject can take decisions. The transcendence offered by the art object that comes to life during such processes is specific and unique each time. It is not generalized, and yet it is shared. And therefore I talk of neither subjectivity nor objectivity, but transjectivity, and therefore I locate the transject both at the level of the subject, artist and viewer, and at the level of the art object. This doesn't mean that artist and viewer are in the same or in a symmetrical position. There is a certain reciprocality without symmetry and indifference. The aesthetical phenomena of affective fascinance and cohabituating join with the primary affects of awe and compassion and draw a proto-ethical zone in between the ethical and the aesthetical as we use to understand them. So they influence both ethics and aesthetics, but they do not confuse them or confuse between them. And this is very important. We are not talking about aestheticizing the ethic or ethicizing the aesthetic. We are talking about a certain dimension and specific possibilities, a kind of a shifting zone that lead to redefinition of both zones and to redefinition of beauty and of the sublime, to such an extent that my students revolt and they say, why don't we invent another word to say beauty or to say sublime? We need other words because these words are so charged already. We think that we intend a certain consensus of taste or that which is nice or whatever, and it's not at all these definitions. But we can do some reading on that, so I can give references. So, we will get back to the art object and then to psychoanalysis and back to the art object, and that's how we're going to work. I want to signal already that if we are classically talking about the aesthetic affect of the unheimlich, and we are talking about anxiety, I put this primary awe and primary compassion on that same level. They signal as anxiety, but something else happens. So it's another possibility to read also into the work of art. Psychoanalysis today continues to function under the general assumption that the repressed is charged with either aggression and or sexuality, even though it is clearly evident by now not only that such material are not repressed at all, but on the contrary, they are overwhelmingly visible. So I'm going to criticize my own métier. The repressed of our time is the material that is charged with awe and compassion. Any revelation of compassion and of awe are immediately perceived with suspicion. They are viewed as hiding something else, as precisely hiding aggression or domination or sexuality or appropriation or whatever. We suspect it. And I think that this is very interesting. How can we continue to function as if aggressivity and rage and all that is repressed? As if this is what we really need to make, the patient free itself out of, where it's all over the place and all the time. We suspect compassion and awe that we believe to be defensive or reactive, if not simply false. Thus we have emptied and perverted by a long process of what we take to be our critical and analytical, progressive and even radical mind, some of the most precious and delicate roots towards a certain knowledge of the other and of the cosmos. Because primary affects are at the same time accesses to the world and to the other, and already a kind of knowledge. Anxiety is already a kind of knowledge. It's a way to feel who is the other, and also to impose on the other certain qualities or project on the other. These roots evolve in a spiralic way by disaccessing and unaccessing the other and the cosmos along the insights that might emerge from these affective roots. The ignorance of their potential grows. So we are indeed reinforcing abjection and rejection, which too are always, first of all, ways to know the other and the cosmos, ways to create the other, of course, according to our own imagination also and fantasy. And so our critical means reveal, in a circular reflectivity, more and more abjection and rejection in the world and in art and in the other and in us. So I would say that if aggressivity and sexuality were major reasons for repressing contents in the forming years of psychoanalysis, those phenomena neither shock nor surprise us anymore. And there is a certain competition of how far we can still shock and still surprise. But it doesn't work at all. We are repressing events accompanied by affects of awe and compassion that I do not intend as religious signifiers, but like anxiety itself, as affective, immediate signals that function to alert us to a certain proximity, to a potential or actual joining in differentiating from the other, joining on condition of difference, joining with a stranger, or joining the stranger within the recognized other, joining the anonymous in the known, and approaching this secret or holiness in the I and non-I encounter event. In the domain of art, awe and compassion alert us that something have already come to happen, or is going to happen, just like anxiety, and that this something has an affective resonance felt by us via our mental or psychic strings and registered by some traces we can consider as threads, that's the way I give them, and that this something is located at the threshold of an ethical zone in the sense that it opens, like anxiety, an access to the other. An encounter event takes place. Its resonance is located at the threshold. It has not reached yet the ethical domain per se. It is the almost ethical occasion. Since links, strings and threads between I and non-I, and memory of the connections, and not presence or lack of object, compose the elusive reel between trauma and fantasy, we, as subjects, are not languishing or not only languishing for objects. Rather, we subjects are languishing for border linking with the other on that certain level. We are looking for the elusive links we feel towards the animated and the non-animated alike but differently, trying to trace and describe the roots, trying to open and reopen the time-space of a virtual passage to the other by what I call communicating and not communicating, in a time-space of between. And the spiralic becoming of that possibility, which I think Marguerite Duras calls eternity, which is a possibility of life, is also a kind of eros. I don't know if we will have time today, but I was talking about this kind of eros in terms of seduction into life, which has to do both with art and with the transference, with the analytical position and with the maternal position, a seduction which is not sexual but ethical. But we might not have time to elaborate on that. But this is also one of the issues I think that we should take about the ethics of psychoanalysis. The time-space of... now I'm going to tell you that what we're going to do from now is take these ideas into two areas. As I said, one of them is art and what is the function of art. And the other for today is very important for me is maternal subjectivity and the concept that I coined the ready-made mother monster. The way we are using in therapy, the ready-made mother monster, wherever we need to find the cause for suffering, for a suffering that is simply the suffering of not being attuned with the world. We cannot accept these existential anxieties. We need to find reason, and the reason is sometimes it's the father, sometimes it's the mother in their function as ready-made monsters. So we must, I promised a few years ago that we will talk about that, and so today we're going to fulfill the promise. And therefore I might stop myself in the middle on that paper in order to be able to move to the other and treat the consequences of their disrecognition of compassion and awe for the, let's say, the social and even political and surely family tissue. But let's say some more about art. The time-place of art is for me a copoietic spiraling duration space or passage. This is a transport station of trauma, as well as, and at the same instance as, a space of transmission of jouissance, of joy. Jouissance to be understood here, not necessarily in terms of aggression and sexuality, and trauma to be understood not necessarily in terms of that which is painful, but more that which is looking to receive some kind of sense. Art's transformational potentialities has to do with both this passage and this station. Inspiration, here is another word we need to redefine that I'm going to use. Inspiration is always a secret, enigmatic transpiration, something that happened in between, on a level of these strings between I and non-I. To transcend the subject doesn't mean to reject it. To transcend the object doesn't mean to reject it. And therefore for me, it doesn't matter, the work of art could be an event or an encounter or an action, or it could be an object because whatever it is that transcends and makes of it a work of art is beyond the object, doesn't need to reject the object. I think that's not the question. This is, it continues to function as a question, but it continues for 50 years to function as a question, as if something is a product, has a product as object, it is less good or better than if there is no object at all. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is that transcends and makes something into a work of art, it doesn't matter if it's object or subjective co-emergence or whatever. So you can broaden the boundary if you don't, if you are not busy with this kind of reject or the question of reject. This doesn't mean that we don't need moves of criticality, but there are different modes of criticality, and some of them have become a habit and are not critical at all. It has to do with rejection, with automatic rejection. We are so used to it, we are so clever, we have become so clever, we don't leave anything anymore unanalyzed and non-rejected in potentiality. So think about the resistance and the force of criticality, of compassion, and this is a suggestion. In the sense that something is happening here. And we can see that this is one of the moves of a human move, of an infant human move towards the world. It's clearly primary and an access to the world. But here is what is very interesting, because if we talk about that which transcends the object or the subject, and if we talk about transjects, the move of connection and counter events of connecting, if we try to abuse them in any case, animated or non-animated, in subject or object or things, inspiration disappears in any case. So it doesn't matter if this is objects or not. If we will manipulate whatever it is that is still art in all that, art will disappear, leaving us with disgust and dismay, influence and control, subjects and objects in isolation. Trauma is the non-assimilated, non-understood event. Trauma is not necessarily that which wounds me. It is, by definition of psychoanalysis, that which doesn't have a sense, and we have no language to capture it. Fantasy, phantasm, is its first elaboration toward understanding, and therefore it is usually illusional, and of necessity imaginary. Then comes the symbolic communication. Art is another kind of transformation into knowledge, a way of functioning through communicating. So, in psychoanalytical relationship, in any therapeutical relationship, transference is also a space, time, and duration of jouissance and of trauma. As I said, not necessarily aggressive, not sexual necessarily, but still a space in which we are fragilized, in which we are fragilizing. And there is the potentiality for healing, but there also the potentiality for re-traumatizing. It's the same. Try to abuse transference and it breeds nothing or catastrophe. Transferent works for transformation in communicating and communicating. In art, it is the aesthetical working through that labors in the research for truth of communicating, where the relations to the thing and to the other are primal. In therapy, it is the ethical working through that labors when the relation to the other in its search for its true, whatever this means, comes first. But if we look through the angle of transjectivity, of co-emergence, An in-between field clarifies itself. Something, a field, which is not the third, is not created through two subjects in interrelations, is not the third, but a kind of a string by which we discover the phenomena that the traces of the other are inscribed in me, and my memory, in a way, functions in the other. So it will be, I keep into the notions of I and non-I and strings and transjectivity as not the creation of a third space. I'm not saying that this does not happen. It happens too, but that's not the level we're talking about. So, before I move to the other subject, I will say one word that I have distinguished in the move of fascination in terms of the work of art, but in other terms as well. Two different modes. One of them I did not distinguish, it's Jacques Lacan, that I've named Fascinum. And the other move or mode that I named fascinance. And I also distinguished two aesthetic affects, what Freud called the unheimlich, and what I've called the co-inhabituation, and in a more shortly and less precisely, the heimlich. The dangerous fascinum and the creative fascinance, the opening of that same space, are not parallel and not equivalent and do not correspond to these two different aesthetic experiences. These are four different and important notions and parameters that we can start to get used to. With the anxiety of the uncanny, the unheimlich, therefore, in parallel to that, we can talk about the anxiety, almost anxiety, of the heimlich, in the sense that compassion and awe are not exactly anxieties, but they function on that same level as signals. And there is no question here of returning to the source, or returning to the maternal or to the womb or to home. The heimlich compassion and awe, there is no possibility of returning or building a home. That this is the sense of co-inhabituating. This is the sense of the spiralic and counter-eventing. We are turning in that search for an home, but there's no question of finding it, because there is always the necessity of the other, of a stranger, to be there, and we are always going to be surprised. So I think we need to say that. And now to the maternal, and we remain in that, but the material become more, maybe less complicated, because we are acquainted now with some concepts. Maternal subjectivity, first of all a remark, psychoanalysis usually sees the maternal as the object of the infant. The infant think about the mother or the father like this and like that and so on. They are our objects, sometimes they are also our subjects. But it is very rare to find an elaboration of maternal subjectivity in psychoanalysis. And surely I'm heading towards the matrixial feminine subjectivity in men and women, and the matrixial maternal subjectivity. And what is the meaning of that? Maternal subjectivity, which contains both archaic pre-Oedipal and post-Oedipal positions, is also a carrier and a transmitter of the feminine matrixial connectivity that is charged by and charges specific modalities of encounter eventing and makes their effect specific. the infant meets the maternal subject via its own primary compassion. I view the affect of compassion as primal psychic access to the other, since it arises before and also after and also alongside objection. Being primal, it is not a reaction but an arousal. I think we can start to use the idea of arousal as a verb in that sense. And like anxiety, a signal. Compassion signals contact and connection. Contacting yet not being reactive, here is a psychic potential for subjective freedom. Primary affective awe arises too during being with and becoming with the archaic maternal subjects. When the affections of awe and compassion arise in an encounter, they counterbalance objection. They counterbalance early forms of fear, shame, and fear, guilt, charged with anger. In their more elaborated form, they contribute to the transformation of fear, shame, and fear, guilt into mature, non-reactive forms, what we can call ethical shame. Is not only something we want to get rid of. Feminine matrixial encounter eventing means differentiating in re-encountering another, first of all the mother, a non-I, an archaic mother, or few non-Is, in a duration of pregnancy, or in a duration of like pregnancy. The co-emergence of two or few I and non-I over time stands for transsubjectivity and transjectivity, which are not endless multiplicity and not endless transgressivity and not endless fragmentation. So with the transjectivity in the matrixial, a possibility that begins with the connection between infant and mother, or even pre-infant and becoming mother, there is a possibility that resists both endless transgressivity and the subject in identity. It's not that transjectivity in my language is endless, because it depends on affects. So it resists also the endless web, the web of webs, this endless connectivity. After birth, as a continuity from the prenatal human stage, the transjective potentiality enters and informs the first affective arousals. Allowing ourselves to think about this stage and position in each human subjective beginning is allowing ourselves to consider singular transjectivity before and alongside subjectivity, and realize its impact on subjective sphere. The knowledge and recognition of limited transgressivity and transmissibility, limited by singular affective encounter event, give us this ethical tool for resisting the endless transjectivity that traverses us, as well as for resisting our own soul narcissistic subjectivity. The feminine matrixial subjectivizing mode in males and in females resists both the narcissistic self and endless fragmentation. Awareness to the conjunction of maternal matrixiality and primal human compassion and awe is the potential site, therefore, in my view, for human resistance and freedom. If we take it from that archaic state into a certain awareness to what is the meaning of that, and then a choice of that meaning. In that sense, encounter eventing is not about emergence in intersubjective relation or in object relation, but about another subjectivizing stratum in which transgressivity and subjective position are not in contradiction, but are never allowed to go to the extreme. Transgression and connectivity are not illimited here, because they rely on the affective access of the I to the non-I, and on specific time-space duration constellation, specific pregnancy of I with its strangers. The other becomes specific and cared for by these accesses. It becomes specific as it is cared for. Partial transjectivity in the subject is enabled and bounded, as long as the subject fragilizes itself to allow an encounter of that kind. The fact that it is in our possibilities and even virtualities doesn't mean that we are going to access it each time. In this sense, the feminine matrixiality resists the global web and offers a resistance in non-reactive self-fragilization. In self-fragilization, the I contacts the vulnerability of the neighbor or the stranger. Now I move to the maternal in all that. What we might call the positive experiencing of the maternal matrixial is usually absorbed by the psyche of the I, our psyche, the infant. Its traces are inscribed unremembered, but they have nourished and they continue to nourish the I all throughout life. The negative experiencing, pains, whatever their source are, that are accompanied by anger and fear, is the forever potentially remembered, the waiting to be attributed of memory, real or phantasmatic, looking for formulation, because it is formed as a disturbance to the fluidity of nourishment and well-being. In other words, our capacity to remember good experience is very small, because what we remember is what stopped good experience. The good experience simply nourishes and we move on. For these reasons, for reasons of this delicate imbalance, and also because of the delicate transsubjective and transjective tissue in the subject, the therapist or the analyst must mix its reverie with an active intentionality to hold or access the maternal and also the paternal and other archaic figures of the patient's matrixial web by some kind of compassion and respect, while accessing the patient with respect and empathy. The compassion towards the intimate non-I, the archaic figures that are also sometimes still participant agents in the scene of present reality, father, mother, brother, friends, relatives, husbands, unconsciously nourish the transsubjective dimension of the individual subject and revive its primary compassion. It works against the tendency, compassion towards them by the therapist, works against the tendency to split and to project aggression, one's own revengeful thought, onto others. The failure in primary compassion leaves the subject, the infant to begin with, at the mercy of paranoid schizoid mechanisms. The psychoanalytical fantasy to find the ultimate cause of human suffering by empathy to the subject without compassion to its early environment or present environment leads to increasing failures in the subject's primary compassion, a royal road to split and to falling towards what Balint called the basic fault, there is an illusion that during the certain moments of therapy, the patient arrives into a crisis of a basic fault and cannot come out of it. And we are blind to the possibility that certain attitudes promote and bring about the basic fault. This same fantasy, therefore, the fantasy to find a cause for just any suffering, shapes the figure that I have named ready-made mother monstered, offered in different modes and in different masks by the therapist as the cause for the subject's suffering. We cannot remain with enigma, and that's a problem. Attacks on the non-I, on the others, the mothers, due to over-empathy and over-identification with the narcissistic self of the infant I, which limits the compassion towards the non-I, limits the capacity to hold the non-I, the figures that the patient relates to under caring intention and respectful attention, doesn't only produce mother hate and father hate, but also break the fragile tissue of the capacity in us for trust or respect. And then we are left with no tools to balance rage and anger. So we see an outburst of rage and of anger. This doesn't mean that there are no situations where the paternal or maternal instances were painfully traumatizing. This doesn't mean that there's no abuse or that we should not talk about abuse or that we should ignore. I'm not talking on these extreme cases. I'm talking about the good enough subject, good enough parental figure, whatever, and their process of turning into ready-made figures for projecting aggression by a process. And I thought that I will give a name to that process so that it become more easy for us to identify it. I think that the concept of empathy is not enough. The concept of empathy is not sufficient. By the way, it was also a concept in art in the beginning of the century. There was the question of art, abstraction, and empathy. So now I'm talking about empathy within compassion or empathy without compassion. Because of course we need empathy to understand all the pains and suffering of the subject, but we need an empathy that still holds the environment and doesn't break the environment into pieces, does not attack the environment. It's already sufficiently difficult for the patient to attack its environment. It doesn't need our attacking its environment. So empathy without compassion produces an attack, finally not on the other. It looks at that moment it looks as if we have found targets. We attack this or we attack that, the patient wants to attack. But the real attack of empathy without compassion is an attack on the aesthetical and ethical potentiality of the subject itself, on the potentiality to transform traces of trauma, an attack on the capacity of self-healing in a sense of balancing our own anger and our own rage. Now there is a special attention that we must make here to these figures of instant cause of suffering, when the figure of cause of suffering is the figure of the same-sex parental figure. The matrixial same-sex connecting and differentiating string needs special care and attention in the psychoanalytical and in any therapeutic processes. As the transsubjective processes by which the male infant the son, differentiates itself from the male figure's father, for example, and the female infant, daughter, differentiates herself from the female figure, mother, are very delicate. And this is the same-sex difference is an issue that to which I dedicated a certain paper. We're not going to repeat it here, but I'm claiming that a major, if not the first, sex difference is a difference not between us and the other sex, but within the same sex. Sons and father is a big preoccupation to understand sexual difference. Daughters and mothers is a big preoccupation. And this is a very delicate issue. And lack of compassion towards the figure of same-sex differentiation perforates holes in the matrixial web, because we never know if what we treat without compassion had already been absorbed in us, is a part of us, or is it really in the other? So we have to pay special attention not to assume that there was a split and we can really say this is outside, this is inside, this is a cause, this is an effect. When the therapist keeps her compassionate attitude towards the other's non-I, the patient, in fact, can express anger safely. Its anger doesn't destroy the matrixial web, as long as the therapist keeps the affective, compassionate channels open towards them. In other words, the patient can safely hate his parent as long as the therapist doesn't over-identify with this hate, doesn't take it as the whole story, in a move of empathy without compassion. Because to have an adult join our infantile instances, infantile archaic instances, and taking them with over-identification has a very, very strong effect. When the therapist doesn't over-identify with the hate, let's call it, the possibility both to express it and, what is more important, to transform it is opened. Because what we care about is not a space where we can express just anything that comes to our mind. The idea behind it all the time is that we can transform it and become creative in our own universe. When the therapist gets involved by way of empathy without compassion, there are more chances that all kind of mechanism of anger will get fixated. Empathy to the I without compassion to the non-I of the I hurts the potential of the I for transforming the primal affective O into ethical respect, harm the potential for transforming the primary affective compassion into an ethical compassion, because this is not automatic. The passage is not an automatic. It is not because we had it as we are going to have it. And for the evolvement from witnessing to witnessing with the H in parentheses, and from there to witnessing, to the possibility to witness, and for the transformation of the primary affective fascinance, a kind of trust in the world, into singular aesthetic maturation and into ethical trust, which again is a choice. Ethical trust, ethical mistrust, these are choices. Usually I talk, before talking about primary compassion, primary O, I'm talking about the capacities that are already evolving before we are born, the capacity for compassion, C-O-M/passion, the suffering together, enjoyment together, anything that goes on is together and is inscribed in different subjective instances, I and non-I. Compassion opens by a kind of resonance that we can call inspirational because it works by inspiration in a sense. It opens the original human capacity that will later on be revealed for awe and for compassion, that will appear after birth, of course, in the contact with primal, intimate, and still yet anonymous, uncognized, known without cognition, figures of care. When awe and compassion are mixed with moments of fascinance rather than with moments of abjection, the aesthetical access to the other and the stranger, each time in its specific revelation by a mental state of reverence, reverie, is enabled. You will probably find here a hint to Bion, an invitation to read Bion, and a certain suggestion that we can add into the reverie a reverence, not in a sense a religious reverence, but in the sense of keeping open the primary affects of awe and compassion, while remaining, reverie refers to the therapist or the analyst, in a state of openness to receive all kind of association. It's not enough to be open and in a state of reverie and to receive everything is not enough. We have to be able to receive things from a certain ethical position, which I call seduction into life, and which includes the capacity to keep awake these early accesses into life. This conjunction leads to respect rather than fear and trust rather than a greedy gripping on the passage from primary compassion to ethical compassion. Due to the archaic subjectivizing contact with the maternal position, already in its pre-maternal stage, the primary access to the world by awe and compassion, as I said, balance paranoid and schizophrenic accesses, and later on balance the depressive position. The state of reverence reverie reveals a specific non-sexual eros, the potentiality to access the other and the cosmos through compassion and awe persists and evolves all during lifetime. These affective accesses indeed fragilize the self and indeed open the boundaries of the subject. It is, however, precisely the self-fragilizing, the transject that can contact the vulnerability in the other without re-traumatizing the other. The transsubjective sphere accompanies the individual subjective sphere, the way we feel ourselves to be bounded in our body limits, as well as the mutating multiple schizosphere, and we are rejoicing or suffering within it with awareness to it or without awareness to it. I'm making a point here that an awareness to it means that we can also use it in sort of creative ways. But in any case, we are transconnected, affectively transconnected. Awareness to it allows then a free choice to transcend the self while retracting oneself from endless transgressivity and to move to a certain affective responsibility and to move from witnessing to witnessing. I don't know how much time we have here, so I'm going to jump again and to get to some things that are important. As I said before, we have to be careful not to find reasons for that which doesn't have a personal reason or particular reasons except perhaps life itself. I think we believe that this is a part of our analytical tool and criticality, but there is a certain blind assumption that everything has a cause in a certain sense. And that particularly in therapy and analysis, that everything has a cause in previous paternal or maternal or parental failure. So I developed some notions to deal with that and to find coordination for therapists mainly to deal with this problem. And I think that what is important is to realize that there are existential anxieties of devouring and existential anxieties of abandonment and an existential anguish of not enoughness. And it is crucial to distinguish between the existential anxieties of devouring and abandonment on the one hand, and the narcissistic anxieties of devouring and abandonment on the other hand, and the traumatic real abandonment and devouring in the sense of over-domination on yet another hand. It is also crucial to distinguish between the existential anguish of not enoughness, that the world is never exactly what we expect it to be, that we are never really exactly reattuned to the world as we wish to be, existential anguish of not enoughness, and the narcissistic demand to abolish instances of not enoughness, the way we insist that the world will be exactly as we want. And this is already, we have to make the distinction. It is not a judgmental distinction. We move from existential anxieties into narcissistic anxieties, but it's the role of the therapist and the analyst to make the difference, so that we don't look for reasons for existential anxiety. We look for reasons for disturbances in narcissistic anxieties, okay? And so the primal, what I call the primal mother fantasies, the primal mother fantasy of abandonment, I have been abandoned, and the primal mother fantasy of devouring, she had dominated me, so she was terrible because I was dominated all the time, appear as a response to these existential anxieties and the fantasy, the mother fantasies of not enoughness, first of all, appear as a response to a certain existential anguish. When these fantasies are taken for unremembered infant realities in the therapeutic attempt to resolve narcissistic anxieties, a distortion is introduced by the theory, by the analytical theory, to the flow between existential anxieties and the primal fantasies, and instances of repathologization rather than of healing or care. So here again there is a lot to say about that, but there is, I think, a tragedy inherent to Freud's psychoanalytical démarche, which he couldn't do better, I suppose, because he was a pioneer and he started the move of psychoanalysis. But Freud discovered that there is a primal fantasy of the sexual abuse of the father. It is not that that cannot happen. Sometimes there is a sexual paternal abuse. But Freud discovered that in any case, for almost every patient and every girl patient, there will be these fantasies. And he made it possible to distinguish between fantasies of sexual abuse and traumatic, real sexual abuse, because he introduced the idea that this phantasmatic mode is necessary for the development of sexuality, that we have to go through that, and that that's okay as a fantasy. Of course, if it comes into reality, this is a big catastrophe. But it is interesting, he discovered that because he discovered that with each and every patient he meets the same fantasies. So he thought either he lives in a world where all the fathers are sexually abusive, or there is a strong fantasy there which gives a reply to something which life offers, which is the enigma of sexuality. So all the primal fantasies are replies to basic enigma of life. And both Freud and Lacan and everybody discovered, in fact, that there is this demand, the insufficiency of the mother. She never gave me enough, or she abandoned me too early, or she was devouring, and so everybody discovered that this repeats itself from patient to patient to patient. But the move to recognize that there is a primal mother fantasies of that kind was not taken. And therefore, in each specific case there was a research to find out in what way the mother failed and in what way the father failed and so on. And there was not enough capacity or possibility to elaborate these conditions as primal fantasies. Now, what happens is that if we do not recognize that, and if we start to find causes and reasons for that, there starts an endless process of research, because we don't really find, or we hardly find, endless process of research for unremembered memories, compositions of all kind of unremembered traces, producing through the help of the mother monster, ready-made. And there is a certain false solution to something which has no solution, which is certain abandonment in life itself, certain too much in life itself. And we can imagine that in a very, very simple way. That we can imagine that as adults, if somebody that takes care of me, my mother, disappears, I can still imagine that she might appear. But if she disappears and I'm a baby and I need her, this is catastrophe forever. It still doesn't mean that the mother abandoned. It means that maybe she went to the toilet and came back. So we need to have tools to realize that these fantasies are helpful to elaborate primary realities that are traumatic by nature of the existence itself. And we have to understand how to make the difference when they appear between was there really a trauma or was there not a trauma, but life took its course. So I added to the list, we have a small list of primal fantasies that usually regulates male sexuality. We have the castration, we have the origins, we have a minimal list. And so I added to the list the three mother primal fantasy. I started to say that the difficulty for that is that the result, the anger that results, the endless anger that we don't know where to posit it and how to get rid of it, is in a very deep sense a self-hate. Because on the subject-object level, we can make a split and say, I am this one and I reject or I'm angry with that one. But on the transsubjective level, on the matrixial sphere, we cannot say that because we don't know who is where and what is the transgression that took place. So this hate revolts becomes a self-hate and hits the capacity to become a mother. I wanted to call it, to make it clear, this kind of a mother trouble that we have, the daughter's betrayal. But we are, in many senses, all daughters. Sons are also daughters in that sense. And even every mother is a daughter. So we are all males and females, daughters in that sense. So it's a kind of an existential betrayal, the daughter's betrayal in us.
is assisted by the search for an imaginary cause for existential anxiety and anguish and for the unremembered past. I would therefore rather say that psychoanalysis has betrayed the maternal by the attitude of empathy towards the patient without compassion towards the maternal and paternal figures, and in that way betrayed the human subject as such. Because certain psychoanalysis went too far in the imagination, but in the transference, the therapist itself will become the total, wonderful mother or father figure, which is also a kind of an illusion, but is also creating a phallic split and substitution. And I suppose that this could continue without attention, without enough attention, because this was a source of narcissistic joy in the transference relations itself. We like to be more than good, yeah? So we enjoy the split. And so when this is working up to a certain extent, this is self-nourishing. But to think that therapy, that we only want in therapy to assist our narcissistic pains or wounds, is to take us as patients very partially, as if we are creatures that do not want to achieve any kind of ethical maturity or creativity. So the symbolic articulation of matrixial transjectivity that I was working upon exposes that pain and catastrophe of the splitting processes that can be caused by the therapeutic attitude of empathy without compassion. And the rest of it I will invite you to read. And yeah, I think that the rest of it I will invite you to read. It's going to appear very soon in a Journal of Maternal Studies, I think it is called. Journal of Maternal Studies that is dedicated to there was a conference in London called Mother Trouble, with a little O, mother, with a little O. The little O is referred to as well in this essay, but I think that we will stop now. This is heavy stuff.